Hey guys, my name is Michael and I'm an incoming MD PhD student at UPenn. And today we're going to be talking... Hey guys, welcome back to .md. My name is Michael and I'm an incoming MD PhD student at UPenn. Today we're going to be talking about everything that you need to know about the MCAT, including my own personal study plan, what materials that I use, and also some tips and advice that hopefully will help you also study for the MCAT. So let's jump straight into it. Okay, first, to give you a little overview of basically my entire MCAT study schedule. So basically, I took the actual test on September 13th, 2019, which was basically in the middle of my sophomore and junior years, like the summer beforehand. I started studying in the middle of June, so basically 3 months prior, immediately after spring term ended. And at the same time, I was balancing two things. I was also doing shadowing in the meantime, and I was also doing research as well. I had a summer research fellowship. And so I basically had to revolve my study schedule for the MCAT around these two activities. I took the AAMC sample test when I started studying, and I scored initially a 505, which was, for me, it was a lot lower than what I wanted to ultimately score. So that made me concerned initially. The major key things that I took away from that sample test were I was really lacking in biochemistry and also in psychology and sociology. In terms of like the car section and also chemistry and physics, I was actually doing pretty well and at the level that I wanted to stay at. And so those sections weren't really that big of an issue for me going into the process. And again, I took the MCAT between my sophomore and junior years. And so what that means is that I had already taken cell biology, I had taken introductory physics, and I had taken general and organic chemistry. However, I had taken no biochemistry courses and no psychology and sociology courses. Basically, the diagnostic test confirmed what I already knew about my level of content knowledge across the 4 different sections of the MCAT. And so after I took this sample test, I was a little bit concerned because I wasn't performing as high as I would like to. But basically, there was no other time for me to be able to realistically take the MCAT besides between sophomore and junior year. For example, if I delayed it and took it next summer, I would have to take the MCAT while I was applying to medical school because I wanted to go straight in without any gap years. And that was just going to be a very difficult process. I couldn't also study for the MCAT during the school year either because Caltech's course load was too rigorous for me and I couldn't manage studying for the test as well at the same time as balancing my coursework. That basically narrowed it down to this summer between sophomore and junior years. It wasn't the ideal time, but it was basically the most ideal out of all of the different options that I had available. I just had to rip the band-aid off and get it over with. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense of my overall study schedule and what are the different things I had to focus on in my study routine. In terms of my daily study schedule, I had to revolve my MCAT studying around the 2 other activities I was doing that summer, which were clinical shadowing and also a summer research fellowship. And so basically my daily schedule looks something like this. I would usually wake up around 7 and then have to go to either lab or shadowing at 8 a.m. and I'd have to stay in lab or shadowing until 2 p.m. After I got back, I would study from like 2 to basically dinner time. And then after dinner and kind of just taking a break for a bit, I would continue studying for the rest of the night until around 10 p.m. Usually I would try to call it at around 10 p.m. But of course, just doing wet lab experiments, you can never really predict your schedule that well. And so sometimes I had to stay up really late in lab. I had to wait for experiments that were time sensitive to be finished. And so oftentimes I ended up sleeping in lab and trying to balance late night studying with waiting for experiments, stuff like that. So it was just more realistic for me to just stay in lab during that time. And yeah, that schedule sucked as bad as it sounded. So I didn't really have a social life during that summer. I was basically a bookworm. I was always doing something productive during those 3 summer months. I don't think your schedule necessarily needs to be as crazy if you didn't have as much content to learn from scratch, because again, I had to learn biochem and the PS section, basically everything from scratch. But regardless, I can almost guarantee you that it's going to suck. I think, at least in my personal experience and in my opinion, there is no dedicated MCAT study time. You have to really just work around your own personal life and what other things are going on. In other words, you got to give yourself some tough love. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the different study materials that I thought were helpful in at least my own studying. So before we talk about study materials, it's important to recognize I basically broke down my 3-month study period into 2 separate parts. One part was focused on learning the appropriate content and making up for things that I hadn't learned in the classroom, and the other part was actually practicing the material in a AAMC-like format. So for content review, I almost exclusively used TBR, or the Berkeley Review, to basically catch up with all the things that I hadn't learned previously, such as biochemistry and the PS section. I think I threw in a little bit of Khan Academy there, so they had some very helpful videos online if there was a topic that I particularly didn't understand, but in general, I really relied on TBR. I also want to point out that during this time frame, during the first 2 months of when I was trying to learn content, I exclusively used TBR for only learning content. And what that means is that I didn't try to do any of their practice tests, their practice questions. I had initially tried to fit those in, but because of one, time crunch, and also I just felt like the questions that they had were just too difficult and weren't test-like at all, I didn't try to do any of their practice questions. Also, I'm not sure if TBR would work for everyone. Berkeley Review has this reputation of being very densely packed with material and sometimes goes more in-depth in certain topics that are maybe necessary for the actual MCAT. For me, that was really helpful because I would rather just play it safe than sorry and just try to memorize a few extra things that might not actually be necessary but could come up on a test at some point. But if you're more of a visual learner and you don't like reading as much, TBR might be more of a difficult tool to use. I also recommend studying all 3 sections at the same time. So the CP section, biology and biochemistry, and PS. Obviously, there's no real studying that you have to do for cars. You basically don't want to do them sequentially because you're going to forget stuff over time. And again, so this content review section basically took about 2 months out of the 3 for my total study plan. So towards the end of this content review study frame, I basically started shifting gradually over to doing more practice tests. To give you a little bit of sense of basically how my scores changed over time. So remember that I initially started off with a 505. About 2 months after I had started studying, my score jumped to a 517 and basically hovered around there for those 3 practice tests that are provided by the AAMC. I'll put down a detailed score breakdown somewhere in this video, so you can see basically how my scores progressed over time. In general, I tried to take a practice test once every 2 weeks. Although as the study date neared, I think I started getting to like every week or so I took a practice test. So while also practicing with official AAMC material, I was also practicing with other materials that are usually free and can be found online. So things like Anki, a lot of like helpful review guides from Reddit. So for example, I would just look up a particular topic that I was struggling with on r/MCAT on Reddit and just look up an Anki deck there and just download it. So someone usually has already made it. I would use these Anki decks to review things like amino acids, common biochemical pathways, literally all of the terms and concepts from Psych-Soc, because again, it just wasn't familiar to me. And again, there's also a lot of really great resources online that are completely free, such as like the Kaplan quick sheets. There's an 86-page like lazy man's version of like a Psych-Soc review basically. And there's also a set of review sheets that I got from somewhere. I'll link all of these materials down in the description below in case you guys want to check them out. I also used Exam Crackers, or I think it's also abbreviated as EK. So EK is known for having like very condensed down material. So it's really good as like just a quick refresh of like the major concepts that you should know for the MCAT. Technically, EK is not free, but I did get it from a graduating senior who basically gave it to me for free, so I was very lucky there. And so I just kept going over these resources over and over again when I wasn't taking a practice test. I would use Anki on car rides, before I went to sleep, while brushing my teeth, sometimes even while showering as well, just trying to go over things in my head. And I think I got a little bit psychotic with the material and stuff like that, but I wanted to get to a point where I was literally living and breathing that material. I also did some extra practice with some of the question bank materials provided by the AAMC. It's not a free resource, and I initially thought it would be nice to have some additional practice with the actual test makers, but in my experience, the question bank questions, they were very variable and they weren't really test-like at all. They were just kind of like, sometimes they were very difficult, sometimes they were extraordinarily easy. And so I would use them kind of just as like a content review, but I would never read too much into like the actual scores that they gave me. They were basically solely used for extra practice. The main resource I really want to highlight during this practice test phase is that to treat your AAMC practice tests seriously. You do have to pay for them, but I think they're a very worthwhile investment because they are a good indicator of what score you get on actual test day. The only problem is that there are only 3 different practice tests. I think there might be 4 now, but at the time I was studying, there were only 3. And so this means you should try and wake up early and try and simulate actually going to a testing center at some other site that might not actually be your room, and try to take a test maybe at the library or something like that. Also try and get like a pre-test day routine established, and also practice that before your mock tests as well. Take the review process very seriously. Like I would spend hours like looking over the questions that I got wrong. Why did I pick them wrong? How could I have actually got this correct? Was it a content issue? Was it I didn't read the question carefully enough? I would spend a lot of time going over those and making sure I fully understood how to do every single question before attempting another practice test. And so going into test day after all of this studying, frankly, I had not performed as well as I wanted to on the 3 practice tests provided by the AAMC. I know I don't really have a right to complain because the practice tests that I took, they were all, fantastic scores, but I did want to score a little bit higher than what I'd been, performing on the practice tests. However, with that being said, I knew for a fact that I had tried to study as hard as I could for this test, and I literally couldn't have done anything differently. And going into test day, I think that confidence is probably the most important thing. So some general tips. Number 1, find the study plan that works best for you. And so that means you don't want to copy a study plan of someone that got like a 528 on Reddit just because it worked for them, because everyone has their own different study habits and different ways of absorbing different material. You want to arrange a study schedule that works best for you. Number 2 is give yourself some tough love. Studying for the MCAT is not something that you want looming over your head for the next 6 months or like a year or even 2 years. If you're going to say to yourself and commit, I'm going to take the test on X date, you have to treat that as like a hard deadline. That means pour everything you have into your study routine. Don't try and reschedule the exam if at all possible, and do not allow yourself the opportunity to void your exam at the end of the test. Again, I think confidence is the biggest thing. You should be confident that you did as much as you possibly could during the study period when going into test day. This is also probably a little bit debatable, but I personally would not recommend people to study more than like 6 months. Because of the sheer amount of material that you have to memorize and understand fully, you don't want to study longer than that, because then you'll start forgetting things and stuff like that. And just a disclaimer, I know things come up in people's personal lives, and there are some unique parts of people's study habits and learning abilities that might prohibit them from being able to, maybe study for less than 6 months, or they might have to reschedule in the future or stuff like that. I'm just telling you what I would have told myself personally 2 years ago. And so this is completely based on my own experience. I know everyone's going to be a little bit different. Another tip is that improvements are not linear with effort. And so what that means is that no matter how many tests that you might take, you might not see score improvements for a very long time. You might not actually even see it until test day. I would recommend you to study smart and efficiently and continue to persist, even though your scores might not be as high as you would like them to, and you might not see a constant progression of your scores over time. Another general tip is that any studying is better than no studying. A lot of times I've seen my friends and other peers that are studying for the MCAT get kind of like paralyzed, especially at the beginning of their study period, because they don't know where to start, they don't know how to organize their study schedule, simply because it's just such a huge exam. You should just like start with something. Start with something that might be comfortable, start with just any section, and then eventually you'll start developing good study habits over time. You don't need to have like a perfect layout of exactly what you're going to do the moment that you open your first textbook. Also, personally, in my opinion, I felt like I wish I had known about the r/MCAT subreddit a little bit earlier. I felt like there were so many helpful materials that I had only discovered a month out of my exam. So I wish I had started using those things earlier. But yeah, I hope that gives you a little bit of sense on how I studied for my own MCAT, and hopefully that gives you tips and advice on how to improve your own MCAT study schedule. Again, I'll try and include links of basically all of the materials and stuff like that I talked about in this video in the description below. Hopefully this video was helpful for you guys. If I missed anything, or if there's anything that I can clarify on, please feel free to leave a comment down below. Please make sure also to like and subscribe the video. It really helps out the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.